The courtroom fell silent. 14-year-old Noah Miller stood tall, his voice unwavering. "You're all wrong. My father is not a criminal." The prosecutor smirked. "And you have proof?" Noah pulled out a folder and slammed it on the table. The prosecutor flipped through the pages. His face went pale. Gasps filled the room. What was written there changed everything. But what happened next will shock you. Let's start from the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. 14-year-old Noah Miller sat stiffly in the witness stand, his heart pounding against his ribs. His father, Greg Miller, sat at the defendant's table, accused of embezzling millions from his own company. The air was thick with judgment. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors exchanged skeptical glances, and a man in the gallery scoffed, whispering, "Another rich guy who thought he could get away with it." Noah clenched his fists. They didn't know the truth. Across the room, the prosecutor, Alan Cross, leaned in, voice laced with condescension. "Noah, you realize you're defending a criminal?" Noah lifted his chin. "I'm defending my father." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Building pressure. Judge Eleanor Grace tapped her gavel twice, her sharp gaze cutting through the noise. "Let the witness continue." Noah exhaled slowly. He was 14, standing against a room full of adults convinced they already knew the ending to this story. But they were wrong. Cross adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. "All right, Noah. You claim your father is innocent. Tell the court why." Noah's fingers tightened around the wooden edge of the stand. "Because he didn't take that money for himself." Cross smirked, stepping forward. "Then where did it go?" Noah hesitated. This was the moment. He had rehearsed it over and over in his head. He needed them to listen. He inhaled sharply. "To people who needed it more than this company ever did." A pause. Silence settled over the room like a held breath. Cross tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Are you saying your father stole out of generosity?" "I'm saying he never stole at all." Cross folded his arms, glancing at the jury as if to say, "See? Just a kid grasping at straws." "That's a bold claim. You have evidence, I assume?" Noah nodded. "Yes." Another murmur rippled through the gallery. This wasn't what they expected. Cross arched an eyebrow. "Well? Show us." Noah reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, neatly folded document. His hands were steady as he unfolded it. "This is a list of transactions my father authorized." Cross stepped closer, glancing at the paper. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Noah saw it. The prosecutor recovered quickly. "And what exactly am I looking at?" Noah's voice was firm. "Proof that the money wasn't stolen. It was redirected to multiple non-profit organizations, medical relief funds, and scholarship programs." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying these transfers were donations?" Noah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, every cent." Cross flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names of legitimate charities, all linked to transactions. "These are just printouts. Where's the official documentation?" Noah's next words hit harder than anything else he had said so far. "The prosecution already has it." Cross's jaw tightened. The defense attorney, Marcus Henley, seized the moment. "Your Honor, we request that the court review the financial records in full before continuing this trial." Judge Grace tapped her gavel again. "Agreed. The prosecution will submit its financial evidence for verification. We will not proceed on assumptions." Cross didn't react, but Noah saw the slight twitch in his fingers. He knew he had lost control of the narrative. Noah's father sat still, barely moving, but for the first time since the trial began, his eyes weren't weighed down by defeat. Noah met his gaze. For the first time, his father looked proud. The courtroom was still reeling, the atmosphere shifting from certainty to doubt. Noah had planted a seed. But the fight wasn't over yet. Cross took a deep breath, adjusting his stance. "Fine." His tone was controlled, but the stiffness in his posture gave him away. "But if there's even one inconsistency, we're right back where we started." Judge Grace nodded. "Then let's find out." The gavel struck. For the first time in weeks, Noah felt hope. Judge Eleanor Grace's sharp gaze locked onto the young boy in the witness stand. Her fingers hovered over the gavel, ready to silence the restless murmurs spreading through the courtroom. The room wasn't just watching 14-year-old Noah Miller. It was waiting for him to crumble. Noah swallowed hard, his fingers curling around the folded papers in his pocket. His father, Greg Miller, sat behind the defense table, shoulders squared but his expression unreadable. The weight of the accusations against him, embezzling millions from his own company, hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. He wasn't the only one on trial anymore. "I do," Noah repeated, his voice steady despite the pressure closing in on him from all sides. The defense attorney, Marcus Henley, folded his hands on the table. "Then show us, Noah. Show us why you're so sure." Noah took a deep breath, pulling the folded documents from his pocket. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He had spent weeks piecing this together, knowing no one else would. If he failed now, no one would believe the truth. He set the papers down, unfolding them with slow, deliberate movements. "These are financial records from my father's office." Prosecutor Alan Cross leaned forward, amusement flickering in his sharp eyes. "Financial records? That's rich. I assume you're some kind of expert now?" Noah ignored him, pressing on. "They show where the money actually went." Cross scoffed. "We already know where it went, straight into offshore accounts, hidden away." Noah shook his head. "No, it went here." He lifted the papers higher so the judge could see. "Every single transfer, thousands of dollars at a time, to hospitals, shelters, scholarships. The company didn't want to approve the donations, so my father made them himself." The room shifted. Cross's smirk faltered. The judge narrowed her eyes. The jury leaned in. For the first time, someone was listening. Marcus Henley adjusted his glasses, taking the documents from Noah's hands. He flipped through them, his brow furrowing as he scanned the numbers. These match the prosecution's timeline of the missing funds." Cross straightened, his amusement gone. "Impossible. Let me see those." Henley handed the papers over, and Cross snatched them up. His eyes darted across the records, fingers gripping the edges as though he could tear apart the truth just by holding it. The courtroom held its breath. Cross exhaled sharply. "These donations don't change the facts." Noah's jaw clenched. "They change everything." Cross placed the documents down carefully, as if acknowledging their validity would somehow weaken him. "Even if these transactions are real, they don't excuse what your father did." Noah leaned forward. "Then tell me, if someone takes money to buy themselves a yacht, they're a criminal. But if someone takes money to pay for life-saving surgery for kids who would never afford it otherwise, are they the same?" A murmur spread through the gallery. Even some of the jurors exchanged glances. Cross's expression hardened. "The law doesn't work on sentiment." Noah's fingers curled into fists against the wooden stand. "Then maybe the law needs to work better." Judge Grace tapped her gavel once. "Mr. Miller, let's stay focused. Do you have any further evidence?" Noah exhaled. Now came the hardest part. The risk he took. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a USB drive. "Yes, there's more." Cross crossed his arms. "And what's that supposed to be?" Your father's confession video? Noah met his gaze head on. No, it's an email. From the company's board. Cross's confidence wavered. Judge Grace leaned in. Explain. Noah held up the USB. Before this trial, I went through my dad's old work computer. I found an email from a board member. It proves they knew about the donations. They weren't just aware. They threatened my dad to stop. They called it bad optics and told him to find another way. Another ripple of shock ran through the room. Judge Grace gestured toward the bailiff. We will review this evidence before proceeding. Cross's jaw tightened. Noah hadn't just provided an explanation. He had handed the court a reason to doubt everything they thought they knew. Greg Miller, who had remained silent the entire time, finally looked up at his son. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The courtroom buzzed with voices. Some reporters whispered, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Others simply stared at Noah as if seeing him for the first time. Cross turned toward the judge. We request a recess to review this new evidence. Judge Grace nodded. Court is adjourned until further examination of the presented material. The gavel struck. Noah stepped down from the stand. His legs felt weak, his pulse still hammering in his ears. But as he made his way toward his father, he saw something that made his exhaustion fade. Greg Miller, for the first time in weeks, smiled at him. Alan Cross's smirk didn't waver, but his fingers twitched slightly against his arm as he stood with his arms crossed. He was in control. At least, that's what he wanted the jury to believe. Go on, then. Enlighten us. The words dripped with condescension, as if Noah Miller was nothing more than a naive child grasping at straws. But Noah wasn't just grasping. He had proof. He swallowed hard and pulled out the folder he had kept hidden in his jacket. The paper inside felt heavier than it should have, or maybe that was just the weight of the truth. He placed it carefully on the witness stand. I found these in my dad's home office, he said, voice firm despite the tightness in his chest. Bank statements. Every transaction. The money didn't go into some secret account. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. He needed them to listen. He needed them to believe him. It went to charity. The words landed like a hammer against stone. A hush fell over the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, the certainty in the room cracked. The reporters, who had been scribbling without pause, hesitated. The jurors shifted in their seats. Even Judge Eleanor Grace leaned forward slightly. Noah saw it in their faces. Doubt. Cross, however, wasn't ready to let go of his confidence so easily. He took a slow step forward, his expression skeptical but his eyes calculating. And we're just supposed to take your word for it? Noah shook his head. No. That's why I brought proof. He reached for the folder and opened it. Pages filled with transaction records sat inside, crisp and neatly arranged. Every number was there. Every donation. Cross extended a hand, and the bailiff took the folder from Noah before handing it over. The prosecutor flipped through it lazily, as if already dismissing it. Then his smirk faltered. His eyes moved faster. His grip on the pages tightened. Noah saw it. The shift. Cross quickly masked it, shaking his head as he turned back toward the jury. So what? Even if this money was donated, your father still moved company funds without authorization. His voice was firm, but the sharp edge in it betrayed him. He was scrambling. Defense attorney Marcus Henley stood now, his presence a quiet but steady force. If these donations are real, then the prosecution has been misleading this court. Cross's jaw tightened. No one is misleading anyone. The fact remains. Henley raised a hand. The fact remains that you painted Greg Miller as a thief.
But these records suggest he wasn't lining his own pockets. He was redirecting corporate money toward humanitarian causes.
Noah watched the jury closely. Some of them looked uncertain now, their earlier skepticism wavering. But Cross wasn't done. "Even if that's true," he said, regaining his footing. "Charity or not, this was illegal. The company didn't approve it." Noah clenched his fists. "They knew about it." Cross turned sharply. "Excuse me?" Noah inhaled deeply. This was the moment that could change everything. "They knew," Noah repeated, steadying his voice. "The board knew about the donations. They didn't want them public because they thought it would make the company look weak." Cross laughed, a short, forced sound. "That's a bold claim. Any proof of that, too?" Noah didn't flinch. "Yes." Murmurs spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Judge Grace raised a hand, silencing the noise. "What proof do you have, Mr. Miller?" Noah reached into his pocket again. This was his last card. He pulled out a printed email, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. "I found this in my dad's office, too. It's from the company's chief financial officer." Cross took the paper with an exaggerated sigh, clearly expecting nothing. But as his eyes skimmed the lines, his expression darkened. Noah spoke before he could cut in. "It says, 'We cannot allow these transactions to be made public. If we do, it sets a dangerous precedent. Find a way to cover it, or find yourself a new job.'" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Noah turned to the judge. "My father was threatened into hiding what he did. He didn't steal. He didn't profit. He was trying to help, and they made him look like a criminal for it." Cross's fingers clenched around the paper, but the damage was done. Noah could feel the shift now. The jury wasn't just skeptical of his father's guilt anymore. They were skeptical of the entire case. Judge Grace let the silence linger before finally speaking. "This court will review this new evidence. Until then, we will recess." The gavel struck once, but the sound barely registered over the whispers of the stunned audience. As the courtroom began to clear, Noah looked toward his father. For the first time in weeks, Greg Miller didn't look defeated, and Noah knew this fight wasn't over. But they had just won the first battle. Cross narrowed his eyes, flipping through the documents, his fingers gripping the edges with just a little too much force. Pages rustled sharply as he skimmed through the lines, scanning the transactions, the amounts, the recipients, hospitals, shelters, scholarships. The numbers didn't lie. His jaw tensed. "This is impossible." His voice, once laced with arrogance, now carried a thread of something else. Frustration, doubt. Noah's grip tightened on the wooden edge of the witness stand. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his voice remained steady. "No, it's the truth. He's been funding shelters, medical aid, and educational programs for underprivileged kids." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens poised over notebooks. Cross scoffed, forcing out a breath like he had just heard the most absurd thing imaginable. "And why would he hide it?" The question hung in the air for a moment, thick with condescension. Noah's jaw clenched. His eyes locked onto Cross's with unflinching determination. "Because people like you would never believe a man like him could do something good." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, tense. Noah could feel it. The jury, once a wall of skepticism, was cracking. Small shifts in posture. The way some of them now looked at Cross instead of at him. The way others glanced toward Greg Miller at the defense table, their gazes no longer filled with certainty about his guilt. Cross straightened his tie. His movements were controlled, deliberate. But Noah saw through it. The prosecutor wasn't as composed as before.
He knew the case had taken a hit, but he wasn't going to let it collapse so easily. He exhaled through his nose, flipping the pages back as if willing them to show something different. "Even if these transactions are legitimate," he said slowly, carefully, like he was choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon, "your father still moved company funds without authorization. That is, by definition, embezzlement." Noah expected this. He had prepared for this. "He did what the board refused to do," Noah shot back. "The company made record profits last year, and when employees suggested using even a fraction of it for community support, they shut it down. My dad didn't take a dime for himself. He just gave away what they were hoarding." More whispers erupted from the gallery. Noah let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "And let's not pretend like this company hasn't done worse. They've cut salaries while increasing executive bonuses. They've laid off workers while expanding internationally. But when someone actually helps people, suddenly it's a crime?" Cross's lips pressed into a thin line. The jury was listening now. Judge Eleanor Grace leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Cross, does the prosecution contest the legitimacy of these transactions?" Cross's hesitation was barely noticeable, but it was there. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Another shift in the air. Noah saw it, felt it. This wasn't going the way Cross had planned. The prosecutor squared his shoulders. "But legality is not determined by good intentions. The law is the law." Noah let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "So the law punishes the man who helps, but protects the ones who never cared in the first place?" A few members of the jury frowned. Cross's nostrils flared slightly. "That's not how justice works." Noah's eyes burned with intensity. "Then maybe justice is broken." The courtroom felt different now. At the beginning of this trial, Greg Miller had been painted as a thief, a man who abused power for personal gain. But now people weren't so sure. Noah could tell. The way the jury hesitated, the way even Judge Grace seemed more engaged than before. Cross knew it too. That's why he was digging his heels in, refusing to let this moment spiral beyond his control. "The jury will decide that, not a 14-year-old boy trying to protect his father." Noah didn't flinch. "I'm not just protecting my father. I'm protecting the truth." He let his words linger in the charged silence. Cross glanced at the jury, scanning their faces, measuring the damage. He knew. The room had shifted. The certainty of Greg Miller's guilt wasn't so certain anymore. The jury didn't just see numbers on a page now. They saw the human cost behind them. They saw the difference between stealing for greed and taking a risk to do what was right. And that doubt? It was something Cross couldn't afford. He exhaled slowly, flipping the documents shut with a soft thud. No further questions at this time. But Noah knew. This battle wasn't over. Not yet. Greg Miller finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I never took a cent for myself." His words cut through the heavy silence like a blade. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with murmurs just moments ago, now felt like a vacuum, pulling in every sound, every breath. Judge Eleanor Grace tapped her gavel, her sharp gaze fixing on him. "Mr. Miller, you will have your turn. For now, let your son continue." Greg didn't protest. He only gave a small nod, his eyes settling back on Noah, who stood at the witness stand. Noah took a deep breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had come this far. He couldn't back down now. He knew the company's board would never approve those donations. They only cared about profits. His voice didn't shake. He wouldn't let it. The defense attorney, Marcus Henley, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "So he took the money and gave it away himself?" Noah nodded. "Because it was the right thing to do." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some whispered among themselves. Others sat still, absorbing the weight of his words. Alan Cross, the prosecutor, remained standing near his table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "And I suppose he expected nothing in return?" Cross said, his voice laced with skepticism. Noah's eyes narrowed. "He didn't want recognition. He wanted people to have a chance." Cross scoffed, shaking his head. "That's a convenient explanation, Noah, but the law doesn't work on what's right. It works on what's legal." Noah clenched his jaw. "Then maybe that's the problem." The room shifted. Judge Grace shot Cross a warning glance before turning back to Noah. "Let's stick to the facts, Mr. Miller. Your father knowingly transferred corporate funds without approval. Whether his intentions were noble or not, that is still a breach of company policy and, potentially, the law." Noah inhaled deeply. "Then why did no one stop him?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Noah's grip on the wooden edge of the witness stand tightened. "If what he did was so obviously criminal, why did it take so long for anyone to question it? The transactions weren't hidden. They were in plain sight. It's only now, when the board saw an opportunity to get rid of him, that they decided to call it a crime." A ripple of unease spread across the room. Even some jurors exchanged glances. Marcus Henley seized on the moment. "So, what you're saying is that your father's actions were only deemed illegal when it became convenient for the company?" Noah nodded. "Yes. If he had kept quiet and let the company hoard its profits, no one would have cared. The only reason this is a trial and not a board meeting is because he didn't stop." Cross exhaled sharply through his nose. "That's pure speculation." Noah turned toward him, his eyes sharp. "Is it? Then why didn't they fire him first? Why press charges instead?" Cross hesitated for half a second. It was subtle, but Noah caught it. The prosecution had built its case around the idea that Greg Miller was a criminal. But now they weren't so sure. Judge Grace leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, do you have any evidence to support this claim?" Noah's heart pounded. This was the moment. "I do." Henley turned toward him, intrigued. "Then tell us, Noah. What do you have?" Noah glanced toward his father. Greg met his eyes, a silent encouragement passing between them. He had to do this. "I found an email." Murmurs spread again. Cross's lips pressed into a thin line. "What email?" the prosecutor asked cautiously. Noah straightened his shoulders. "It was from one of the board members, sent to my father months before this trial even started. It said, 'Find another way or find another job.'" Silence. Henley's expression darkened. "And you're saying this proves the board knew?" Noah nodded. "Yes, they knew, and they tried to sweep it under the rug, and when my father didn't stop, they turned on him." Cross's grip on the table tightened. The jury was listening now. Judge Grace exhaled slowly. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Miller. Do you have access to this email?" Noah reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the folded printout. "Yes." A shift in the air. Cross's jaw tightened. Noah wasn't just defending his father anymore. He was exposing the truth. And suddenly this trial wasn't as simple as the prosecution had made it seem. Cross pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply. The controlled, almost smug demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial was beginning to crack. He had spent weeks constructing this case, painting Greg Miller as nothing more than a greedy executive who had used his power for personal gain. And now? Now, a 14-year-old kid was systematically tearing it apart. This doesn't change the fact that he moved company funds without authorization. His voice was clipped, but there was a tightness to it now, a frustration he couldn't quite suppress. The courtroom felt different. The confidence that once surrounded the prosecution's case had started to erode, and it wasn't just Noah who noticed. Jurors exchanged hesitant glances. A few reporters had stopped writing, as if they were no longer sure what story they were even telling anymore. But Noah didn't hesitate. He met Cross's gaze, unwavering. "So you're saying that giving to those in need is worse than hoarding millions for executives?" Silence. The words landed like a hammer. No one spoke. For the first time, Alan Cross had no immediate retort. It wasn't just the words Noah had used. It was the weight behind them. Cross had built his argument on the idea that Greg Miller was a thief, but Noah had just shifted the entire conversation. The real question now wasn't about whether Miller had broken company policy. It was about why that policy existed in the first place. The jury wasn't just seeing numbers anymore. They were seeing a moral dilemma, one that the prosecution had never accounted for. Noah could feel the tension thickening in the air, and he wasn't done. "Answer the question," Noah pressed, his voice steady. Cross lowered his hand from his face, his jaw tight. "This isn't about morality, Noah. This is about the law." Noah didn't blink. "Then maybe the law is wrong." Another ripple spread through the room. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in a navy blue blazer, shifted in her seat. Another, an older man with salt and pepper hair, scratched his chin. Doubt. Noah could see it growing. Cross let out a short, forced breath, turning to Judge Eleanor Grace, as if searching for an escape hatch. "Your Honor, we are not here to debate ethics." Judge Grace, who had been silent for the past minute, finally spoke. "On the contrary, Mr. Cross, I believe that is exactly what this jury must consider." Cross's lips pressed into a thin line. He was losing control. Marcus Henley, Greg Miller's defense attorney, saw his opening. "Mr. Cross, let me ask you something." Cross turned to him reluctantly. Henley gestured toward Noah. "If Greg Miller had taken that money and invested it into offshore accounts, bought himself luxury homes, or gambled it away, this would be an open and shut case, wouldn't it?" Cross's response was immediate. "Of course." Henley nodded slowly. "But instead, he used it to pay for medical bills, for housing, for education. Tell me, Mr. Cross, does intent mean nothing in the eyes of the law?" The prosecutor hesitated. A single second. But in that second, the courtroom shifted again. Because that was all the jury needed. That moment of doubt. The idea that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't black and white. Cross straightened his shoulders, forcing an even tone. "The law cannot be bent based on personal convictions." Noah saw right through him. "So if the board had approved these donations, my father wouldn't be sitting here right now?" Cross hesitated. That second of hesitation? It was a mistake, because it told everyone in that room the answer. The jury was no longer focused on Greg Miller. They were focused on the company, on why the board had refused to support these donations in the first place, and on why they had chosen to criminalize the only person who had done something good. Noah felt the shift in power. Cross did too, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Regardless of the moral implications, Mr. Miller still broke the law. The jury must base their decision on legality, not personal opinion. Noah shook his head. "Then let's talk about legality. Let's talk about how this company has dodged taxes for years while slashing salaries. Let's talk about how they gave themselves raises while laying people off. Let's talk about how they had the power to do good, and instead, they did nothing." Cross opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because Noah wasn't wrong, and everyone knew it. Judge Grace let the silence linger for a long moment before finally speaking.
I believe we've heard enough for today. Cross's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't argue. He couldn't, because no matter how much he wanted to control the narrative, it had already slipped through his fingers. Noah exhaled slowly, his hands loosening against the stand. He had done it. He hadn't just defended his father. He had exposed the truth. And for the first time, Greg Miller wasn't the only one on trial anymore. Judge Eleanor Grace sat motionless for a moment, scanning the faces of the jurors. Their expressions weren't as firm as they had been at the start of the trial. Some leaned slightly forward, their brows furrowed. Others exchanged uncertain glances, their initial conviction shaken. She shifted her gaze to Alan Cross, the lead prosecutor. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Cross hesitated. For the first time since this trial began, his confidence had cracked. When he had stepped into this courtroom, he had been sure of Greg Miller's guilt. He had built his case meticulously, preparing for every argument, every loophole the defense might try to exploit. But now, doubt lingered. And Cross knew something the jury didn't. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Every trial followed a rhythm, a predictable beat. Cross would present his case. The defense would scramble for excuses. The jury would see through the theatrics. And by the end, justice would be served. That was the plan. But now the rhythm was off. The beat had changed, because a 14-year-old kid had just flipped the entire case upside down. And Cross couldn't ignore it. The financial records, the documented donations, the emails, the fact that Greg Miller hadn't pocketed a single cent. He had spent weeks painting Miller as a greedy executive, a man who abused his power for personal gain. But instead of a thief, the jury now saw a man who had risked everything to help others. And worst of all, they were starting to wonder why the company had tried so hard to stop him. Cross knew what that meant. The more doubt crept in, the more the narrative slipped away from him. And in a trial like this, losing the narrative meant losing everything. He inhaled slowly, forcing himself to think, to adjust. He needed time to dissect the evidence, time to find the flaw. Because there had to be one. There had to be. He glanced toward the defense table. Marcus Henley, the defense attorney, was silent, watching him carefully. And across from Henley, Greg Miller sat still, his expression unreadable. Then there was Noah Miller, standing at the witness stand, meeting Cross's gaze without an ounce of fear. Cross gritted his teeth. This kid had thrown a wrench into everything. Cross knew he had no choice. Not now. We need to review the evidence. His voice didn't hold the same authority as before. Judge Grace studied him for a moment, then she nodded. Very well. Court is adjourned until further review of the submitted materials. She banged the gavel once. The sharp crack echoed through the room. It was over, for now. The tension in the courtroom didn't dissolve with the judge's ruling. If anything, it thickened. The jury still sat there, some deep in thought, others still glancing at Greg Miller, as if seeing him for the first time. The reporters in the gallery whispered among themselves, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. Cross exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. He had bought himself time, but he knew this was slipping away from him. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he could get it back. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, but the tension in the air didn't disappear. It lingered, stretched tight like a rope on the verge of snapping. Judge Eleanor Grace sat straight-backed, scanning the room before speaking. Given this new development, the court will adjourn until further investigation is conducted. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. For weeks, the narrative had been clear. Greg Miller was guilty. His name had been dragged through the mud, his reputation left in ruins,
his own company treating him like a traitor. And now the certainty was gone. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some reporters whispered to each other, flipping through their notes, recalculating the angle of their next headlines. Others sat frozen, pens hovering over paper, as if realizing that the story had changed right in front of them. The jurors, who had once seemed so sure, now wore uncertain expressions. Their eyes darted between Greg Miller, his son Noah, and the stack of evidence that had just upended the case. The weight of injustice, the crushing certainty that had pressed down on Greg Miller since the trial began, slowly lifted. Not entirely, not yet, but enough for him to breathe again. Greg Miller turned his head, his gaze settling on Noah. For the first time since this trial began, the exhaustion in his eyes didn't overshadow the pride. The kid had fought harder than anyone in that room, harder than anyone ever expected him to, and he hadn't just fought, he had changed everything. Greg's fingers curled against the polished wood of the defense table as he exhaled, his shoulders a fraction lighter than they had been an hour ago. He had spent weeks being painted as a criminal, a fraud, a man who had betrayed his own company. And yet, it had been his own son, a 14-year-old kid, who had done what no high-powered lawyer had managed to do. He had forced them to see the truth. The court began to empty. Lawyers whispered in hushed voices, planning their next moves. Journalists hurried toward the exit, phones already pressed to their ears, rushing to rewrite the morning's headlines. Greg and Noah walked toward the heavy courtroom doors, moving past the rows of wooden benches where so many people had once sat, waiting for a conviction that now seemed much less certain. And then, Alan Cross. The lead prosecutor stood near his table, his posture stiff, his face blank. But his silence? His silence said more than any argument he had made today. For the first time since the trial began, he had no response. No smug remarks, no clever retorts, because he had lost control of the narrative. Noah slowed his step. He didn't look angry. He didn't gloat. He just looked at Cross, as if seeing him in a way no one else ever had. And then, with the quiet confidence of someone who had just shifted the course of everything, he said, "Maybe next time, don't assume the worst in people." The words hung between them like an unspoken challenge. For weeks, Cross had framed this case as black and white, right and wrong. But the evidence, the truth, had revealed something messier, something that didn't fit into his perfect prosecution. And deep down, Cross knew it. He knew that Greg Miller wasn't the villain he had made him out to be. And more than that, he knew that Noah Miller wasn't just some kid trying to protect his father. He was the reason this trial wasn't over yet. And for the first time that day, Alan Cross had nothing to say,